Honored guests, Your Excellencies, we're delighted to welcome you to the 6th Global Security Forum on Strategic Competition, the Complexity of Interdependence. I'm Dr. Colin P. Clark, Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center. And along with the team, we welcome guests today from over 50 different countries for 3 days of important and dynamic discussions. We commence our program today by welcoming to the stage His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. في البداية أود أن أتقدم بالتعازي للشعب الإيراني الشقيق في وفاة سيد رئيس الجمهورية زميل وزير الخارجية والوفد المرافق لهم إثر الحادث الذي تعرضوا له يوم أمس. نسأل الله تعالى لهم المغفرة. في البداية أود أن أرحب بكم اليوم بمناسبة انعقاد النسخة السادسة من منتدى الأمن العالمي تحت شعار المنافسة الاستراتيجية، التعقيدات الناتجة عن الاعتماد المتبادل. نلتقي مجددا في الدوحة لنبحث التحديات الأمنية التي تواجه العالم وننظر في تفاصيل الواقع الأمني العالمي بموضوعية وما فيه من مخاطر وسبل تحييدها وما فيه من فرص يمكننا اغتنامها. السيدات والسادة، في عالمنا الذي شهد تحولات كبيرة في السنوات القليلة الماضية، نرى الأزمات والصراعات تتوالى وتهدد بشكل غير مسبوق الأمن والسلم العالميين. فمن الحروب والصراعات العسكرية والهجمات السبرانية وتوسع أعمال التجسس والقرصنة الرقمية إلى الكوارث البيئية والأزمات الإنسانية وموجات الهجرة الجماعية. تصاعدت التوترات الجيوسياسية بين مختلف القوى في أنحاء العالم وصولاً إلى عودة خطر انتشار الأسلحة النووية والحروب الجديدة بأسلحتها غير التقليدية. وكلها تحديات تتجاوز في آثارها الكارثية الحدود الوطنية والإقليمية، بل وتتجاوز ميادين المعارك إلى الفضاءات الإلكترونية. ومع ظهور مراكز نفوذ متعددة ومتنافسة، فإن الصراعات الجديدة والحروب غير التقليدية بين القوى العظمى تعرض النظام الدولي لخطر حقيقي. فعلى سبيل المثال إلى الحصر، الحرب في أوكرانيا التي هزت أسواق الطاقة العالمية وتسببت في تراجع الأمن الغذائي على نطاق واسع، وأزمة الدولة المركزية في أفريقيا والتي تتداعى آثارها في السودان ومحيطها، والاستقطابات السياسية في الأمريكتين، والتصعيد بين الولايات المتحدة والصين مع تداعياته على سلاسل التوريد العالمية والتجارة الدولية. وإذا كانت القائمة السابقة لا تكفي، فإن منطقتنا تواجه العديد من المخاوف الأمنية مع اتساع نطاق الصراعات الإقليمية الأهلية والبينية. تعيش اليوم في ظل تصعيد مستمر ومتصاعد يهدد أمن المنطقة والعالم. فالحرب التي تدور رحاها في قطاع غزة حصدت ولا زالت تحصد آلاف الأرواح، ويتفاقم كل يوم حجم المأساة الإنسانية هناك، مما يستلزم تكثيف الجهود الدولية، سواء تلك المعنية بإنهاء الصراع أو الجهود الإنسانية لضمان وصول المساعدات. لقد أثبت التاريخ لنا بأن كلفة أي احتلال وتبعاته يكونان دائما أكبر من أي مردود متوقع للمحتل. فإن سياسات الاحتلال والتهجير القسري والعقاب الجماعي لم تثمر يوما نهاية لأي صراع، بل كانت وقودا لاستمرار العنف واتساع رقعته. الحضور الكرام، إن أي صراع يشتد ويتفاقم تتفاقم معه التبعات الإنسانية المتراكمة، وعلى رأسها موجات اللاجئين والهجرة غير الشرعية التي يقودها الفقر الناتج عن فشل الدولة وانهيار الهياكل السياسية والتطرف الذي تعززه حالة اليأس وفقدان الأمل في مستقبل أفضل. ولأي كارثة إنسانية تأثيرها على سلاسل التوريد العالمية، كما حدث نتيجة للحرب الروسية الأوكرانية، وهو ما نشهده حالياً في البحر الأحمر نتيجة للحرب على الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة وقطاع غزة. وبالفعل نشهد اليوم تمدد هذه الحرب نحو مناطق أخرى في الإقليم، حيث تمددت المواجهات حتى وصلت إلى البحر الأحمر، وشملت مواجهات مباشرة بين إيران وإسرائيل، مع تصاعد خطر المواجهات على الحدود الجنوبية في لبنان، ناهيك عما يخلفه هذا التصعيد الخطير من تعزيز لسردية التطرف التي تنخر في كيانات الكثير من دول المنطقة. السيدات والسادة، وسط هذه الصورة القاتمة للوضع الإقليمي والعالمي، بذلت دولة قطر كامل جهدها للمساهمة بدور حيوي في تعزيز السلم والأمن العالميين عبر جهود الوساطة وفض النزاعات وإنعاش الاقتصاد العالمي وإعادة بناء ما دمرته الحروب والأوبئة. ففي عالم تعصف به الأزمات، بات العمل المشترك مطلوباً الآن أكثر من أي وقت مضى. وفي هذا الإطار تستند سياستنا الخارجية إلى مبدأ التعاون في مواجهة التحديات المشتركة، ويعتبر تعزيز التعاون الدولي والعمل متعدد الأطراف جزءاً لا يتجزأ من سياستنا الخارجية. كما امتدت جهودنا التنموية والإنسانية لأشد الدول حاجة، من خلال تقديم المساعدات لبناء القدرة على الصمود وتعزيز قدرات الدولة المؤسسية في مختلف القطاعات. وفي سبيل تعزيز السلم والأمن العالميين، أصبحت جهود الوساطة وفض النزاع أحد الركائز الأساسية لسياستنا الخارجية. وبفضل هذا النهج استطاعت دولة قطر أن تتوصل إلى عدة هدن واتفاقيات من شأنها التخفيف من حدة النزاعات والتوصل لحلول سلمية لها. ولم تقتصر هذه الجهود على منطقتنا فحسب، بل امتدت لتشمل الوساطة بين روسيا وأوكرانيا للم شمل الأطفال المتأثرين بالحرب مع ذويهم، وبين فنزويلا والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وغير ذلك من الوساطات التي تجري حالياً، وفي ذات الوقت الذي نستمر فيه في جهود الوساطة بين إسرائيل وحركة حماس. إن التزامنا في قطر بالعمل على منع انهيار السلام والأمن والاستقرار في المنطقة وتوظيف الدبلوماسية لحل النزاعات بالوسائل السلمية ليس مجرد التزام سياسي، بل هو التزام أخلاقي ينبع من مسؤوليتنا الجماعية تجاه النهوض بالشعوب الأكثر ضعفاً ونشر الأمن والاستقرار العالميين. الحضور الكرام، من المهم أن نلتقي في هذا المنتدى وغيره من فضاءات الحوار لنبحث عن حلول خلاقة لمشاكل عالمنا، ولكن الأهم هو أن نتوافق على حلول أخلاقية تعكس إنسانيتنا وإيماننا بالمبادئ التي توافقنا عليها في المجتمع الدولي. حلول تطبق المبادئ نفسها علينا جميعاً دون تمييز، في ظل إيمان بأن الإنسان هو الإنسان، وأن رفع المعاناة عنه لا يجب أن تكون رهينة لاعتبارات سياسية، أو أن تحدد الأولويات فيها عبر النظر في عرق من يعاني أو انتماءاته الوطنية. محبط ومؤلم كم الأزمات والتحديات التي تعصف بنا، ومعظمها من صنع أيدينا، ولكننا في قطر تعلمنا أن الفجر يشرق من صدر الظلام. كلنا ثقة بقدرة شعوبنا على تخطي التحديات التي تواجهنا، ونؤمن بأن النوايا الحسنة والضمائر الحية والإرادة الإنسانية هي من سينتصر في معركة الحياة. وتمنياتي لكم بنقاشات مثمرة خلال اليومين القادمين، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, for your distinguished remarks this morning. We thank you for setting out many of the important topics that will be addressed at the Global Security Forum over the next 3 days. Next in our program, we warmly welcome high-level remarks from His Excellency Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, Prime Minister of the Republic of Iraq. He will be joining us virtually. These remarks were recorded Saturday, May 18th.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدات والسادة المشاركون في المؤتمر، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يشرفني أن أشارككم هذا المؤتمر المفعم بالطموح، وأتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لدولة قطر الشقيقة لاستضافتها هذا الحدث في تأكيد وتعزيز آخر لموقعها في طليعة التجارب الناجحة في التنمية والبناء. كما أثني على تركيز الاهتمام نحو سؤال الأمن وحلوله المستدامة، الأمن من جميع الأوجه والمسارات التي تمس حياة الشعوب وتحكم سعيها لتحقيق معيشة كريمة في ظل سلام مستدام. ومعروف لكم ما كابده شعبنا العراقي عبر العقود الماضية من آلام وحروب وديكتاتورية ومواجهات استهلكت جهدا ودماء عزيزة، واستنفذت وقتا ثمينا لم يستثمر لصالح آمال شعبنا. ومع كل هذه العقبات تمكن العراق من تجاوز أكبر الشرور وانتصر في معركة الإرهاب، وانتقلنا كعراقيين من مرحلة الانتصار إلى مرحلة التنمية بقوة في ظل ديمقراطية مستقرة. وآلت حكومتنا على نفسها أن تغير حال الاقتصاد العراقي نحو الانفتاح على الشراكات المثمرة والتنوع في الموارد، ومواجهة التحديات المزمنة في البطالة والخدمات والفساد ومحاربة الفقر وتدعيم الإصلاح الاقتصادي بجميع أشكاله. ولم يمض إلا عام ونصف العام حتى باتت الأرقام الاستقرائية للاقتصاد تتحدث عن صعود إيجابي متشعب ومتنوع ويعد بالمزيد. وشهدت البنى التحتية المؤسسة للنهوض الحقيقي اندفاعات لن تتوقف بعون الله، ويوما بعد آخر نجتاز عقبات كانت تبدو صعبة بل مستحيلة في سنوات ماضية. ومن المهم أن تفهم هذه الخطوات ضمن سياسة شاملة تتبناها حكومتنا مدعومة من مجلس النواب، تعالج بها كل ما يمس المواطن في معيشته وتلبي طموحه. من هذا التشخيص انطلقنا لتحقيق هذا الهدف الممكن. واجهنا في كل القطاعات المستهدفة صعوبات وتحديات شتى، لكن إيماننا بقدرة أبناء شعبنا وتمسكه بإعمار بلادنا وتنميتها أمر لا تحده حدود. الصحة والكهرباء والخدمات العامة والبنى التحتية المدنية والنظام المصرفي المعافى والإدارة الحكومية النزيهة والعمل على محاربة الفقر واستغلال الطاقة واستثمار الغاز ومواجهة التغيرات المناخية والبيئية وتوفير الغذاء والسكن والتعليم وغيرها، كلها صارت اليوم بمثابة بنود في العقد الرابط بين المواطن وحكومته، وهي دعامة استمرار الخيار الديمقراطي والسبب الأول الذي يدفع المواطنين إلى المشاركة في الانتخابات كوسيلة دستورية لا بديل لها لاختيار الحكم وصنع القرار. لقد وضعنا نصب أعيننا أن تغيير فلسفة إدارة الدولة وتطوير أسلوب تنفيذها سيكون ذلك مدخلا صحيحا لاستغلال الثروة، وبالتالي فإنه القاعدة الاجتماعية الأولى للحكم الرشيد. فأسسنا صندوق العراق للتنمية وفتحنا الأبواب أمام القطاع الخاص بضمانات سيادية، وشرعنا في التعاون مع مؤسسات الائتمان العالمية. واليوم نحث الخطى الواثقة في مشروعنا الأبرز، مشروع طريق التنمية، هذا الممر الاستراتيجي الذي سيربط مصالح المنطقة ربطا إيجابيا متكاملا، وسيؤكد دور العراق التاريخي بوصفه ساحة آمنة لصنع الفرص والتكامل الاقتصادي وتشابك المصالح بين الشعوب قبل الحكومات. ونعتقد واثقين أن هذه هي دعائم أمن واستقرار في المنطقة. السيدات والسادة، أن الأمن لم يعد رهين قرار سياسي أو عملا ميدانيا فقط، إنه حزمة متداخلة من الإجراءات والمصالح المتبادلة المشروعة والنظم التجارية والاقتصادية المنصفة. ولو دعمنا الأمن بكل مفاهيمه بترابط اقتصادي صانع للحلول وساند لمواجهة التحديات، سنجد أن أسباب الاضطراب ستنكفئ وستتراجع فرص إثارة الفتن وتضمحل منابع الصراعات، وسنخصص المزيد من الموارد إلى قطاعات التنمية. ولا يخفى عليكم ما تسبب به العدوان على المدنيين في غزة والأراضي المحتلة والموقف الدولي الضعيف أزاء الحق الفلسطيني. هذا العدوان الذي بات يهدد المنطقة بأسرها بانتشار الصراع، كما أنه أهان القانون الدولي وانتهك حرمة الدم، وهو يمثل اليوم أكبر تهديد لشعوب المنطقة واستقرارها. لهذه الأسباب فإن العمل على وقف الإبادة الجماعية الصريحة بحق الشعب الفلسطيني ستمثل بداية لمنظومة الثقة المتبادلة في مساعينا نحو تحقيق الأمن لشعوبنا ولمنطقتنا. وسيكون العراق أول المساهمين في إعادة الحياة والإعمار لغزة وأهلنا الصامدين فيها. أشكر إصغاءكم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Prime Minister al-Sudani, for your important remarks. Please remain seated, guests. As His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar, departs. Thank you. Thank you, His Excellency.
the organizers. This is a very important platform that allows us to exchange views about those very important issues. Of course, as a former lawyer and practitioners in law, I'm obliged not to, of course, disclose.
I just asked you who's at breakfast.
Many of the issues that's related to our pending mediations. But I agree with you. Qatar has created for itself a strong reputation to be a comfortable hub for mediation and dispute resolution for years. One of the recent group that we've managed to host in this hotel as well is a group of different politicians from Chad. And we've managed to successfully reach an agreement at the end by signing the Doha agreement for the Chad government. And this is something important that we will continue to do.
Well, you're the lead negotiator right now in negotiations between Hamas and the Israelis involving Egypt, the United States. We have a term called in the room where it matters. You're in the room where it matters. Can you take us into those negotiations, which seem so hopeful for a moment, then seem to crash and burn? What is the state of play with Gaza and Israel right now?
It's a very important question, and this case is precisely one of the most difficult and complicated cases that we faced historically. Qatar, as you know, we're very much engaged in the talks between the different disputes by the past years between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So this is nothing new for us when it comes to talking to both sides. But this case is a little bit, has its own complication. And that's for two main reasons. The first one is the extreme lack of trust between the two sides that makes the job of the mediators even more difficult to try to find a breakthrough or bridge the two sides and fill the gaps to reach an agreement. The second difficulty or challenge that we're facing is simply the military operations on the ground, which makes it even more difficult for the mediators to get the parties together. You know, in spite of those challenges, Stephen, we've managed to secure an agreement in last November, which helped us to get at least 109 hostages, also 240 detainees out, and bring somehow 7 days periods of calm for the people in Gaza. We want to achieve that again, and that's why we continue our efforts till today to try to get the parties together and overcome many of those challenges. The more that we sit on the table, the closer that we get into the agreement. But as they always say, if there is a will, there is a way. What is missing here is really the political will. And that's continuation of military operation and the intention of continuing the proceeding of this war makes it always difficult for the mediators to get an agreement.
So Qatar is not a member of the Abraham Accords. You have not normalized relations with Israel. How complex is that for you serving as a mediator to the different sides? Are you not perceived by Israel to be a host of Hamas, a friend of Hamas? How do you convince both parties to trust you?
As I mentioned to you, Stephen, this is nothing new for Qatar. I mean, we have more than 25 years of experience in this field. What makes Qatar as a unique mediator, if you allow me to elaborate on this point, and then I'll get back a little bit on Gaza's situation, are several important factors. One of which, Qatar's at start doesn't believe in the impossible mission for mediation. As you know, historically, we have dealt with extremely difficult and complex mediation cases. Taliban in the US was one of, as an example, of those very difficult scenarios that we're passing by. Another important factor that we're doing is that crises today, Stephen, are extremely complicated. It's way different than 10 years or even 20 years before. So which requires Qatar to equip its team with the right amount of expertise. Now we're facing somehow more of a multidisciplinary crisis that includes an economic component, a political component, legal, security-related component. So we want to make sure that our team is always equipped with the right experience. That creates a strong reputation for Qatar to be able to create that sort of a breakthrough. Another important factor, Stephen, is that our role, as His Excellency elaborated as well in his introductory remarks, our role does not extend to our region. Historically, we've been known of dealing with several cases under the Middle East region, but now we're even going beyond that. We're resolving conflicts between Venezuela and the United States so far away in distance from the state of Qatar.
Oh, we're going to get to that.
I'll elaborate a little bit more in a later stage. And a third important component, which I think is extremely critical, Stephen, is that we truly rely on our trusted international partners to help and assist. This is a role that Qatar cannot do by itself, but we are very much engaged with our international community. In our view, those important factors has created that strong reputation that Qatar could fulfill that role, and that created the trust on that level. And therefore, since day one, before committing or starting any of the mediation activities, Qatar's always seek the approval of the parties and the approval of the mechanism and the procedures that Qatar would illustrate in day one and has been accepted by both parties.
Do you see any hope that the negotiations over the remaining hostages and the negotiation in Israel and Hamas can be revived? Because you seem to get agreement from just about every party, including Bill Burns, the CIA, the Egyptians, everyone but Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government. But in that case, is it in shambles, or can it be brought back into another phase?
We got used to, in the last few months, to pass by a periods of ups and downs. At a certain periods, we become a little bit more optimistic that we're getting closer to any agreements. Other scenarios, we get a little bit down due to other factors, some of which I have elaborated already, such as the military operations, especially in Rafah, which is extremely dangerous when it comes to our own assessment. And therefore, in spite of those challenges, we remain committed. We remain solid to that requirements and engage with our parties as much as we can.
The Qatar hosts the largest U.S. military installation in the region in Al Udeid, and I believe in January you extended the base for another 10 years. As I said, if you walk to the Sheraton Grand Hotel for breakfast or any of the other hotels, you can run into the most interesting people in the world, in my view, who are here. So America is here, but Hamas and certain wings of members of the Hamas operation we are. I interviewed, we'll see it later, but former National Security Advisor to President Trump, Robert O'Brien, and he praises Qatar for playing an outsized role in problem solving around the world. But at the same time, he expresses hope that you'll move Hamas to Iran or somewhere else. What is going to be the long-term relationship between Hamas? Will Hamas continue to reside in Qatar?
Stephen, we're focusing on today. And today, there are a lot of points on our agenda that we're focusing on, one of which is the mediation efforts. And for us to have a solid mediation, we want to make sure that our line of communications with both sides are effective and direct. And for us to deal with other matters, I think it's going to be simply a distraction. And as I mentioned to you, our mission is not done, and we're continuing to exploring every single possibility and opportunity that we can invest in to create this breakthrough and allow the people of Gaza to have another period of a longer calm that will allow them to have more of a sustainable life.
Now, I know that you had interactions frequently with the foreign minister of Iran. My condolences to you, because I know you had a relationship with him. We got the bad news, of course, yesterday about what happened. You negotiated with Iran on behalf of the United States in a very high-profile case. In fact, since you started your job, which was, I think, in 2023, this current version of your job of doing this, it's been remarkable the number of cases you've been in, but one of them was this case with Iran, trying to get prisoner release of U.S. Detainees that were held by Iran and a $6 billion loan freeze. Can you take us into that? You said it was one of the hardest negotiations you've ever done. I'm interested what specifically made that such a big lift?
Again, this is actually one of the first cases that I found in my desk at the first day of the job. Is really the nuclear background of Iran's operation.
Did you want to take the job, or do you want to say, hey, give this to someone else?
Well, it's challenging, and we like to accept challenges. But generally speaking, Iran is a neighboring country for us, and we share a historical relationship built on trust between us. And we're very grateful for keeping that line of communication open. We are strong advocates for dialogue, and we believe in the power of diplomacy, and therefore we've been very much engaged thoroughly with those matters with the Iranian authorities, as well with our strategic partners in the United States. It was an intense talks, a very difficult, and I always say that one of the most difficult shapes of mediation is when both sides reject the idea of sitting at the same table, which makes it even more difficult for us not to exercise by moving from one meeting room to another, but simply because it makes the job harder, that you need to deliver those points of considerations to the other sides and trying as much as possible to create that bridge that will bring the parties together. Of course, with our intensive hours of work on this case, and thanks for our also regional and international partners in helping us, Oman was a very important and active partners on this case as well. We've managed to create a breakthrough, at least in those very difficult scenarios. Now, I would understand as well that the conflict is not done. And this is part of our strategy, Stephen, is that I follow what I call by the low-hanging fruit approach, is trying to divide that big conflict or crisis into pieces as much as possible and trying to deal with the closer or the easier somehow for the parties to get an agreement.
What are some of the tools you use? And I don't mean to be silly about this, but you know, in American history, there's the famous story of how Jefferson, trying to resolve a problem between Hamilton and Madison, and I recognize this is very narcissistic and I apologize, picked the place they ate, picked the what the folks at, where people sat. It's a very important part of American lore that trying to create a deal between two rival politicians in this. If you watch the movie or the play Oslo, same thing, very much about the culture, the surroundings. So I'm just interested in what tools did you use the World Cup to solve some of your problems? What are the various techniques that you use to actually break through icy resolve?
Well, Stephen, Qatar has, as I mentioned to you, has always been perceived as a comfortable environment for disputed parties to come and try to express their concerns and for us to deal with those concerns by presenting some proposal solutions to those conflicts. And I think that reputation didn't come as ease. It came by time, it came by experience. We're building up the team as much as I mentioned to you. We're become more comprehensive to cover different areas of the party's concern. That creates a strong reputation that Qatar is able to handle that matter. So gaining the trust.
Football tickets?
Well, the World Cup is a very important social event that allows the parties to join together. And by the way, one of the interesting matches was for me to attend the match between the US and Iran, where I was somehow accompanied even some of the Iranian delegations, the senior delegations to the World Cup. So it's definitely an important event that allows the parties to come together. But I think what's most importantly is how the mediator conduct the mediation procedures at the negotiation table. And I think that's a very critical matter that we've, as I mentioned to you, we built that experience by time, and now we know how to approach those sensitive topics when it comes to dealing with different parties.
Do you find the US to be a responsible partner in negotiations you've been in?
They are strategic partners, and they're very much always available in receiving those matters and receiving us as a trusted mediator in different of those disputes. As you know, in the past 3 to 4 years, we have dealt with several cases that the US has always been one of the disputed parties historically, and therefore we very much enjoy that engagement with the US and appreciate that strategic partnership.
So I don't know if you were involved in this. This is a genuine question I don't know the answer to, but I know that Qatar enjoys a close relationship with Rwanda. Right now, Qatar Airways is investing heavily in the Rwandan airport, Rwandan Airways, etc. And one of the thorns in the side of at least the US-Rwanda relationship, but Rwanda globally, was the story of Paul Rusesabagina, Hotel Rwanda and whatnot. I broke the story globally when he was, when his sentence was commuted. Broke that story when Paul was released, and he was released into Qatar. And so his family was here, he spent some time here. So you were again part of the backbone of a deal, what I would call a deal, of getting Rusesabagina from Rwanda and then back to the United States. I'm interested in this because it seems like you were regularly called on by different parties for that sort of, if not direct negotiation, because if you talk to Rwanda, this was a judicial decision on their end, not a negotiation. But you're in the background very frequently for lots of these countries. Do you find yourself constantly called to solve other countries' problems?
That's true.
Were you involved in this case?
They're really keeping us busy.
Yeah.
But we appreciate this. This is a
Do you
very
send them a
strong
bill?
sign. When I was a lawyer, yes. But this is a very strong sign that Qatar is a trusted partner to deal with those issues. And Rwanda is a very important strategic partner for us and Qatar, and we appreciate the leadership engagement and continuous engagement with us regarding their concerns and sometimes even in the African continent. And as I mentioned to you, Qatar is not limited with specific geographical boundaries or limitation.
Right.
We're going even beyond that. And we're exploring that partnership with other countries as well.
Well, one of the other big efforts you've been involved in, which I found to be very, very moving, was the case of children that had been taken during the Ukraine-Russia conflict and taken and moved to Russia. Now, there are reports that maybe more than 19,000 children have been moved, but there have been, what I would call modest steps in trying to return those, and you've been directly involved with the Russians, the Ukrainians. President Zelensky thanked you for the efforts to return some of the children that had been taken. Then you brought them here to Doha. So tell us about that. I mean, it's a very personal, very moving moment, and I want you to connect it to the possibility that Qatar may be a platform for a broader negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, and what you think the chances of that are.
We enjoy keeping our communication channels open with all countries. And that, I think, allows Qatar to occupy that position internationally. This is a very important case. It's purely a humanitarian initiative and a movement by the leadership of Qatar to help and assist reuniting families with their children. So it requires a lot of reach out and a lot of different strategies to approach the two governments in trying to finalize those matters. And gladly, we've managed to create that breakthrough and allow us to move in. As I mentioned to you, the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine has affected everyone, including us in the region. And therefore, dealing with this bigger conflict in pieces and trying to finalize those steps is a very effective strategy that we're following. And therefore, we're glad that we're seeing the families reuniting with their children.
But take us a step further. I think one of the criticisms that some have of Qatar and the role you play is that you're not out there judging right from wrong among some of the parties you're dealing with. And, I'm a Nixonian, so I look at myself as a realist. I'm fine with villains in the world. You have to deal with everybody. But I'm interested in the challenge that when you look at something like that, many nations in the world, particularly the United States, look at the invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign nation, by Russia to be completely unacceptable, the deaths that have happened, and then the taking of children. How do you maintain the demeanor not to say that's evil or that's wrong? How do you navigate that? And how do you tell the critics of Qatar why that's important?
Stephen, we totally distinguish between our pure political position when it comes to the cases that are surrounding us and our mediation efforts when it comes to the scope that we have already designed for that specific mediation. When it comes to the political position, we're standing with the rule of law. We're standing with the international law and the United Nations Charter. And we will continue to advocate for that, regardless whether this comes from a friendly state or not. We have to say what's need to be mentioned. Now, when it comes to the mediation, we're also following the international law and we're not doing anything legal. Here we're discussing specifically is a specific mandate that comes from the disputing parties, illustrating exactly what types of points of concerns and procedures that both parties would like to discuss. And therefore, we design our work very professionally and we make sure that we illustrate to each party their obligations and their rights when it comes to those mediation efforts. Therefore, we cannot really mix up these two things together. When it comes to the political position, our opinion is very clear, but when it comes to our offering and our help and assistance and resolving disputes, this is something that we will continue to do. History always teaches us, Stephen, that referring to violence or the threat of using violence is never going to resolve the disputes. And the best methods that we have selected is really to refer those matters to more diplomacy and peaceful methods of resolving disputes. Statistically, mediation is ranked second as the most commonly used way of resolving disputes directly after the direct negotiation. This gave us a very strong indication that there is always a way for the parties to resolve their disputes peacefully.
Since you became Minister of State in this role for the Foreign Minister, what's been your most fun or successful negotiation that you actually enjoyed?
I enjoy all cases, to be honest with you.
No.
It's extremely
Okay,
fun
what's the worst?
to go through.
What's the most frustrating?
It's frustrating when you do a lot of efforts and unfortunately the parties doesn't reach an agreement. Of course, this is something normal that touch base
How
on
high
all
would
of
the
us.
Gaza case?
Gaza is a very good example. I mean, the more efforts that we're putting on the table, the more that we're expecting the parties getting closer and closer towards their agreement. Unfortunately, the reality does not reflect that. And there are other factors that I mentioned some of it to you, that really prevents that agreements from moving in. But honestly, it's a different scope of work for me, and this is something that I enjoy working.
Does Gaza and the situation there feel like what you would describe as a genocide?
So the Gaza situation is extremely difficult one since the first hours of that conflict. And we continue to assess and present even clearly our political position when it comes to this issue. Of course, this case occupies the world's agenda today, not only at the regional or even in the international, but mainly under the international institutions such as the ICJ. The ICJ today is extremely busy dealing with several requests by other states related to the situation in Gaza. And therefore, we always rely on those independent institutions to reflect on those important cases and present the realities on those issues.
As you kind of look at these cases, and one of the things in the back of my mind when I think about conflict is I remember the embargo between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. And at that time, I said, who's going to resolve that? Where's the negotiator? Were you available to help solve the problem? But I mean, I know that that's a silly question, but I think part of the question is, how does Qatar become? Is it always a function of conflicts you're not part of that you can do? What becomes an issue in like the tension that you had between the UAE and Qatar? What's the responsible way when you're one of the parties out of that situation?
So it was a difficult period that passed by not only Qatar but also the region to have neighbor countries are in conflict. But we know that the only pathway towards that is really to sit at the negotiation table and resolve that matter, and that will happen in an Ula agreement came into place. And therefore, we strongly believe that being transparent and expressing your concerns directly at the negotiation table is the best pathway towards those issues. As a matter of fact, I was very much engaged in the past difficult Gulf crisis period on the legal cases. I was handling several of the legal cases at that time. But I realized at the end of the line that getting those leaders at the same table and signing al-Ula agreement will be the best sustainable pathway towards a better relationship. And currently, we obtain a solid relationship with our neighbors, and very transparent and healthy relationship as well.
Another case, I mean, you've been so busy since 2023, I can't believe it. And so many of America's cases you've been dealing with, I feel like you're our secret negotiator, James Bond, that we never talk about. But one of them is Venezuela. It's a case that I knew nothing about until this morning, where you negotiated the release of 10 Americans being held for one Venezuelan held in American prisons. How did that happen? And I won't ask you, I mean, it's the fault of the media for not elevating it more, but can you just take us into that room?
Well, the nature of many of the mediation is to remain confidential.
But not after you succeed.
I agree with you. And after we've managed to get an agreement, it went to the media and people knew the role that Qatar has played in that specific case. And our work is continuous. As I mentioned to you, the crisis looks big, but we're trying to dissolve many of those elements so we can reach a better agreement.
But how did that initiate? Did the Venezuelans come to you? Did America come to you?
So, as a matter of principle, Qatar will never initiate a specific mediation procedures without receiving the written approval of both sides. That's a specific condition that we follow, and that's something that we've managed to gain out of both countries who entrusted Qatar to play this critical role. Again, any mediation or direct negotiation would have huge difficulties at start, but because they trust the process and they trust the mediators, they become more comfortable in expressing those concerns, and for us to creatively trying to come up with reasonable solutions that can bring the parties together. That's the example of Venezuela and the United States, and that's the example of several other mediations that we've been involved in.
There was a time, I'm going to be very candid, from my own knowledge and awareness of friends in the Qatari government, where I would argue that America did not treat you well, did not give Qatar the status it deserved. There was an icy period. To what degree do you think the decision to make this form of diplomacy and mediation, a strategic asset of Qatar that has benefited the, has it changed and broken the ice? Do you feel deeply rooted with the United States now?
I think we've proven that we're a reliable international partner, that the United States can definitely rely on Qatar in dealing with the most difficult, complicated, complex cases that are facing us today. And we build that by taking a step and engaging even heavily with the institutions of the United States. So we're not making it a personal relationship. We're making mainly an institutional-based relationship with the different entities in the United States. And therefore, I think our relationship has grown tremendously. And we are now in a position that's way much better even the previous years when it comes to our relationship with the U.S.
Now, Roger Carstens, who is our envoy for hostages, is Roger here? Oh, sorry, apologies, Roger, I'm going to talk about you. He does extraordinary work right now when you look at the, I would say, the industrialization of the taking and detaining, unlawful detaining of people not around the world, not just Americans, but many around the world as an industry to seek influence, to get money, et cetera. Again, this is another area that I know that you're part of the backbone of behind there. I'd love to get your take on how to pull the plug on that industry. And I also want to thank you for working with Roger on his behalf, because I know you do a lot. But talk to us a little bit about that ecosystem of hostages taking and basically state-based taking. This used to be something that was done by non-state actors, but now you have states. Evan Gershkovich, who's an unlawful detained colleague of mine from the Wall Street Journal, held in Russia, is one top of mind, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people detained today.
I always say talking to the right people, practical, makes our job easier. And so we appreciate this friendship and engagement.
I really didn't know he was here. So.
I appreciate this friendship that I obtained with Roger and continuous engagements. I call him most of the time. He called me the other times, and we're trying as much as possible. We engage heavily towards many of those cases. This is important. This is the, as I mentioned to you, the ultimate objective for us to engage in many of those mediations is a purely humanitarian. Is to get those loved ones back to their families, is to get the peoples reunited with their families back again, and that's our main objective. And to have reliable people and closer partners that you can depend on in dealing with those difficult scenarios and difficult situations is extremely important.
When you sort of see the industry growing the way it is, and you see an expansion of the number of people detained, what is your sense of what we need to do to unplug that ecosystem? It's
an unfortunate scenario. It's unfortunate events to see so many people are detained, and they're for several reasons. And when you talk to the governments, they give you different justifications. What's most importantly is how can you create that line of communication strongly with them and trying to get those people out. And I think that's what Qatar continuously proven to the world, that it's able to fulfill that role. But I think most importantly in the global scene, it's important that the international communities also take up those responsibilities. Further engagements by the UN members and those important international organizations are extremely essential to really illustrate this dangerous acts and continue to help and assist in different scenarios.
So I ask this question really cautiously and carefully because I don't want to in any way trivialize what you do. What you do in terms of negotiating, and I look at it as an incredible asset of Qatar. Does being a rich nation help? In other words, I think a lot of people wonder,
Yeah.
are you, lubing up the system here and there?
Let me
This
say-
money, I mean, I remember when you were working on Chad, what are there, 50 different factions? I mean, people don't know that Chad is basically a highly factionalized challenge and problem in a Rubik's Cube. And I'm just wondering, when I was aware of what you were doing with Chad, with other players and factions, you're not, when I've joked about, do you send a bill to someone? The truth is you don't get a bill from it. You're putting a lot of money. I mean, what's your budget for problem solving?
So I'm not going to talk about the budget, but I'm going to definitely tell you that it takes skills and abilities and the right amount of expertise among any other factors. Of course, resources and providing a platform, for a comfortable platform for the disputing parties to come and stay and discuss those concerns are essential. But we know that this is not going to resolve the issue. The problem is not about the size of the room that the parties will sit in or the view that they're going to look at, but most importantly, the process and their points of considerations, whether it will be met or not. And I think that's the important skills that Qatar's obtain and will be willing always to apply that skills in practice.
Any chance you'll help China and Taiwan?
Well, there's no limitations for our reach out, and we will continue to.
So let me ask you just as we close here. I mean, fascinated and I've loved this. And you went to UC Berkeley, I went to UCLA, so we're almost, we're basically cousins. But I'm interested in, as you look out at the world, I was very taken with the fact that you don't enter a negotiation, you don't self-initiate. You wait until you have signed agreements with both parties. You have a highly structured approach to dealing with this. But when you look at there and take your negotiator hat off, your government hat off, when you see a problem out there that needs to be solved that you're just wishing you could get involved with, what would be some of the outstanding issues that you would like to see Qatar play a constructive role in the world?
So as I mentioned to you, because our policy is to always keep the channels of communication open. So we've always been perceived as a comfortable place for several of the disputing parties to come in and refer their matters to Qatar. Now, I have to be honest with you. We've also intensified our engagement with several countries right now around the globe, asking, of course, to assess the current situation, but most importantly, to play an effective role in helping and assisting finding a breakthrough. So this is part of our foreign policy, parts of our continuous engagement with the international community, including the disputing parties.
Who are some of the countries?
There are so many countries. I have to be honest with you.
Who are you having breakfast with tomorrow?
We have a lot of countries in Africa, Latin America, in Europe. We got so much heavy engagement. In Asia, is also not far away from many of those disputes. But again, I think what's most important is that they look at Qatar as a comfortable and trusted mediators to deal with those issues, and therefore we appreciate that engagement.
Are you helping to negotiate between any people in this room or audience that are here attending the Global Security Forum?
We will keep it in easy talks these days.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Dr. Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al Khalifi. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
It is with great pleasure that we introduce to the stage a ministerial fireside with His Excellency K. Shanmugam, Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Law from the Republic of Singapore, hosted by Mr. Ali Velshi, host of Velshi and Chief Correspondent for MSNBC and a weekly economics contributor to NPR's Here and Now.
Take the close one, I'll take the far one.
Okay. I'll take the end.
Take the far one? Okay, very good. Thank you, everybody. And good morning to you.
for thinking that you are in some way the reason for all of these moves taking place. In this context, there was a survey recently in Southeast Asia about how people view US and China. So rather than me saying it, I can look at the survey, which is more representative. For the first time ever,
These are people in Southeast Asia.
people in Southeast Asia, how they view US, how they view China. I mean, the questions are a little precise, but let me just give you some broad sense. I would say for the first time ever, China ranked slightly above the US, but it's pretty much a wash. It's like 50.5% versus 49 point something.
And this is generally polling where we do an approval level.
Yes, something like that.
Some sort of an approval
What do
rate.
you think of China? Or,
Yeah, yeah.
that sort of thing. But again, the picture is mixed because when you go to a second question, how much do you trust each of these countries? By the way, both were not highly trusted, but there were concerns about the economic influence of both countries, but at differing levels. In fact, because China does more, I think there was more concern about China's economic impact. So how you interpret it is a question of trying to make sense of it. But I would say it shows that over time, China's economic weight and economic influence and interactions, people recognize, and its weight is growing.
And this is inevitable. It was inevitable. It's inevitable that the similar things are going to happen in India, which is in the midst of an election right now. So you don't think of these growing tensions between global powers as existential for you. You're thinking about it as what's our best bet from in terms of security relationships and trade relationships, and you'd like to have both with both.
Well, it could become existential if it becomes a kinetic situation. But subject to that, both are essential from our perspective. And therefore, we would say, and we don't, I think you can't make a clear distinction between security relationship, economic relationship, but you would say both need to be around and we need to do business with both. We need to deal with both. And for that, we'll have to, in a way, hope that both can find a new arrangement.
And what does that look like? Because right now, and look, there are clearly efforts, perhaps in the wake of Russia-Ukraine, for China not to get into things that look like direct confrontations with the United States, particularly over Taiwan. But there are also overtures by the Chinese who've been making their way through Europe all the way to France to sort of say, in a post-Joe Biden, possible Donald Trump world where NATO is a weaker military alliance potentially, is China trying to have a bigger role on that front? So it's not just a Belt Road Initiative. It's not just trade relationships where they go, but to say that we might even have a security presence and a security relationship in a way that we haven't had in the post-war era.
If you are the second largest economy in the world, which China is, and you look at the three largest economic centers, one is North America, one is Europe. In fact, Europe is number 2, and China, these three. If you were China, it makes eminent sense. If the US is constantly painting you as the enemy, number 1, to have a closer relationship, security, economic, with Europe. Anyway, Europe is economically important for China, and vice versa. And prior to the Ukraine war, in fact, you could see that Europe, partly because of the presidency under Mr. Trump, and partly for economic reasons, you could say Europe was, while not equidistant, was closer to China than it was before, right? And some people were talking about Europe drifting away and taking a middle path and so on. I'm not sure how realistic that was given the NATO guarantees. But after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think that has made Europe probably realize that in the end, the US is indispensable.
Yes.
And if anything, brought US and Europe much closer together. I don't know what another Trump presidency would do to that, but Mr. Trump seems to recognize that Europe is important for NATO from some of his statements. Every time you write off the US, I remember an old statement from a statesman from a previous era, I think Metternich or someone, that there is a strange providence which looks after drunkards, orphans, and the United States of America. So never write the US off.
Let's talk about, because it's important and you are in the region. India is in the midst of a very, very important election. We seem to think that Narendra Modi is going to prevail yet again. But there have been concerns about India drifting in a direction that feels like a lot of other countries are drifting in, feeling a little bit more autocratic than democratic, curtailing freedom of the press, and doing things that are a little bit worrisome to the West. Obviously, India is a growing and important member in your region. What's your sense of it?
The sense of what you describe as autocratic and freedom of the press? Well, my view of these things is, look, I wish people would talk a little bit more about governance and what it means for people on the ground.
Yeah.
And a little bit less on some of these forms. Anyone who has been in India and who is switched on to all the different channels, I think can be forgiven for thinking that perhaps there is a surfeit of news channels and a multiplicity of viewpoints. If you look at the last 10 years, and I'm not, my primary interests are that of a Singaporean and Singapore's national interest. So let me be clear about that. But I'm simply an observer here. If you look at the last 10 years, by common consent, several 100 million people have been lifted out of poverty. I don't see the international media talking about that much. I see them talking about if A is arrested or B is arrested or C is arrested. I don't see the international media talking about the huge amount of corruption that has been going on before, or whether it has come down or gone up or has remained the same. To me, what matters is how many people are now better off. What are people's lives really like on the ground? What is women empowerment like? What about education for the people in the rural and urban centers like? Not if you're well connected and wealthy, but ordinary people. What are their lives like? And what are they saying? And can anyone really believe that this country, I forget how many states there are, but it's got multiplicity of languages. Some guy in the north speaks Hindi, some guy in the south speaks a completely different language. The script is different, the language is different. It's many different countries, like the Balkans, put together. At least in the Balkans, they all look a little bit alike. Here, they look different too. And I've often wondered, how is India even governable? How does one man or one party or somebody sitting in the center try and put across rules that can apply to this large 1.3 billion people across north to south in a fairly large country? So in that context, I think most people, if you look at governance, would say India has been growing slowly over the years. They used to call it somewhat derisively as a Hindu rate of growth. I think you can say that growth has increased more substantially. I think you can say that a lot of people have been lifted out of poverty. Does that mean that you have to agree with everything that this government or the previous governments have done? No. But I would say when you characterize the positives and negatives, it's far better to look at whether growth is real, whether improvement in lives is real, whether the corruption is more or less, without myself passing a comment, rather than take a very, I'm sorry to say this, but it's almost a lazy way of looking at not you, but often the Western media I read about many Asian countries, including Singapore. It's a headline, oh, freedom of the press is affected, or people are affected. This is autocratic. What does autocratic mean when you have a government that is going for elections across all these states and where the people have the ability to vote the government out? How is that autocratic? It may not be a Western liberal democracy, but that doesn't automatically equal to autocratic.
I think that's an important and distinct point, that there's a spectrum, and it becomes easy for us to find points on that spectrum and determine that some things are autocratic and some things are dictatorial. I grant you your point, and that we are sometimes less nuanced than we should be on that issue.
Can I interrupt and make one more point?
Yeah.
The Americans had this summit of democracies.
Yeah.
In the summit of democracies, they invited various countries,
Yeah.
including a number of countries from around the world, Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan. All of those are great democracies. I have no issues. They didn't think Singapore was a democracy.
Mhm.
They didn't think Sri Lanka was a democracy. They didn't think that Turkey was a democracy. So, I would be careful about this democracy versus autocracy kind of.
So let's just
Yeah.
go narrower. Is there a world in which you see, because we see it in the United States very clearly, that greater exercise of accountability on the part of the press is important to good governance? So let's put aside whether we're talking about democracy or autocracy or dictatorships or forms of government. It does seem to be that the press is under attack around the world in every one of these instances that we're looking at. Is there a way in which we can nurture greater freedoms of the press and then perhaps separate them from some of these conversations about the form of government? Because there can be very good governments in places that do not enjoy full democracy, and yet there is the ability for the press to bear witness to what's going on and hold authority to account.
Yeah. I think, there is an important role that the media has to play. And in every country, my own view is that the media has a role to play both in projecting the country's interests and informing the citizens, telling the citizens what's happening, and informing accurately if what the government is doing, including if the government is going wrong.
Right.
I think there is a role for that. There are two questions. One is, every institution in many of these countries is subject to some oversight. Who has oversight over the media? And second, if the media can effectively be owned by a single media mogul, where does accountability come from?
In some cases, those media moguls are tied to the government. That's where it becomes
Or
tricky for us.
opposite.
Yes.
And the second point I would make is the role of the media must be to inform, to be a watchdog, to be clear, but not to campaign for or against policies. No one has elected the media to campaign. If they inform and they educate and they identify wrongdoing, that's fine. But if they start campaigning, then I think they are crossing the line. That's our view anyway.
Where do you see, let's go right back to the elephant in the room, the United States right now. This is a country that has what some people think is an existential election coming up in November. You have stated, as a small country, that you would like to maintain strong relations with the United States, including security relations, strong trading relationships with the United States and with China. China is a bigger trading partner for you than the United States is at the moment. Are you concerned, and do you think Americans or the world should be concerned about the existential political situation that some describe the United States as facing?
I don't believe the US is facing any existential crisis. It goes up and down. What I do think is that the US has tremendous strengths, and by God, they are really testing those strengths with the system they have. And one might even say the very deep polarization and divisions within Congress the latest I see, it's quite unedifying. It wasn't very long ago when I used to think, oh, the US Congress, everyone is so polite to each other. And that's a model. And within my own lifetime, now I see people talking about each other's eyelashes and so on.
And that was just yesterday.
So, debate has come down, you could say, a notch. And, but, the US has a great strength as attracting the best talent from all over the world and still technology. Never write off the US, but it could be the drug situation, the arm, and so on. And I think also the US leadership in the world, for the reasons we touched on but didn't go into detail, is now in some question because of how the US is seen as responding to different situations. In some cases, invoking international law, in some cases, seem to be acting not quite consistent with international law. And therefore, the US leadership, which the global South had in the past accepted, now is very much a question mark. So both internally, domestically, and externally, I think the US is facing significant challenges, but I wouldn't quite put it as existential.
Well, you make me feel better. I'll take that. Minister, thank you for your comments and your observations from your perspective. It's important for us to have at a conference like this, we're a global conference, to have the perspective of somebody from Southeast Asia who can give us some sense of how it looks from right in the middle of the storm. So we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, everybody.
We warmly welcome to the GSF stage high-level remarks from Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, United Nations.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the state of Qatar. A privilege to be here for this very important event. A privilege to have listened to such distinguished discussions and conversations, as well as the keynote from the Prime Minister. I'm somebody who has witnessed firsthand the hand of Qatar in linking its humanitarian assistance, for which I'm of course engaged, to the vital priority of resolving conflicts that we've heard so clearly from Mohammed al-Makhrifi, as well as from the Prime Minister. Qatar's not just potential, but Qatar's actual role in defining what I've referred to as humanitarian diplomacy, which brings those two aspects together, is seminal. And I say that as somebody engaged in humanitarian work, but with a background in mediation. So thank you very much to Qatar for what it does for the world, as well as to bringing us here. Excellencies, we once had a dream that we could come together to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, that we could develop friendly relations between nations, strengthen peace, and solve international problems, that we could have justice, respect for international law, and a world in which we upheld respect for fundamental human rights and freedoms and the dignity and worth of the human person. And you know, like I do, where those words come from. And yet over the past 3 years, as the Emergency Relief Coordinator of the Humanitarian System, as well as head of the UN Humanitarian Office, indeed going back further as a multilateralist many times in the UN and out of it, and as a humanitarian and a mediator, I have witnessed, as you have, how persistent competition, animosity, and aggression between nations has prevented that dream from becoming a reality for far too many people. How strategic competition has been the hidden and not so hidden hand behind the outbreak of seemingly endless conflicts, and how it has stymied efforts to prevent and resolve conflict. In the last year, as we have been hearing, we have seen the outbreak of unimaginably devastating tragedies and trauma in Gaza and in Sudan. And that at a time when the Ukraine war remains a raging concern. In both Gaza and Sudan, civilians are paying the very highest price every single day, today, perhaps even more than other days, while we fail to reach consensus on solutions. And in Gaza, more than 35,000 Palestinians have now been killed in these 6-7 months, many more injured. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced, many of them serially, searching for safety where little safety exists and where hunger and the threat of the disease continue to escalate. And as I have said recently publicly, our concerns about the anxieties of where a Rafah operation will go are tragically concerns confirmed by events. In Sudan, for over a year, people have faced an inferno of brutal violence. We have reports of horrific atrocities, ethnically motivated violence, and gender-based violence. Millions have been displaced, and famine, this is my world, famine is now on the horizon for an extraordinary potential of 5 million people. I don't think there has been such a threat imposed by famine in decades. In Syria, people are facing the worst humanitarian situation in more than 13 years of terrible war. It's not remembered. Syria has more people below the poverty line each year of this war. Its economy is in ruins, its people displaced, its country divided. In Ukraine, 10 years of war, and more than 2 years since Russia's full-scale and ongoing invasion. Approaching 10 years of war in my dear Yemen. And many more combined years of conflict and instability in places such as Afghanistan, the countries of the Sahel, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and Somalia. And I could go on. In many of these places, strategic competition is not only preventing the resolution of conflict, it is fueling it, with powerful countries in every region arming or otherwise supporting warring parties or protecting them from international restraint. And beyond conflict, we have seen how strategic competition and economic protectionism has prevented an adequate collective response to the climate, to the COVID-19 pandemic, and to persistent economic and social inequality. And our growing connectedness and interdependence have magnified many of these challenges. The climate change, driven by activity in developed and developing countries, is having the most deleterious impact on those who did the least to cause it, often thousands and thousands of miles away from the places of cause. Following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we saw the consequences on food security of millions of people around the world. Mass displacement of people has put pressure on host countries and communities and has been seized on as a pretext for divisive politics, further fragmenting international cohesion. And the highly connected global information space means that malign actors are much more easily able to affect situations in disparate places with misinformation and disinformation, sowing further division, stoking conflict, and putting the security of civilians, my own colleagues in the humanitarian community, and our operations at risk. And the result of all this is that over the last few years, humanitarian needs have grown exponentially. This year, we estimate 300 million people are in need across the globe of humanitarian assistance. And of course, we've never come near that figure before. Displacement, food insecurity, and malnutrition are all at historically high levels. Inequality and poverty, I quoted Syrian case, persist. And we're witnessing an increasing surge in health emergencies and, of course, in impunity. And I'm reminded about impunity by reference to health because of the pandemic of attacks on health institutions in conflict, as my colleague, Dr. Tedros, has often described. So as you can see, I'm not sugarcoating what is a desperate situation, but I do believe there is hope. I have hope because I have the fortunate privilege of seeing the places of darkness and tragedy and sorrow. And in these places, we see also the light of humanity. And I believe that light still burns brightly. We see this in the generosity of host communities, those communities to which displaced people have moved to find safety, and who are always helped first by host communities and then by the international community, who share everything with them. I remember visiting a small township in Burkina Faso a year ago. 300,000 people had descended on that small township of 80,000 people. And those 80,000 people, cut off now by the war with the al-Qaeda insurgent group in that part of Burkina Faso, those 80,000 had shared their food, their assets, their capital with their surprising visitors until there was no food left to share. And the mothers in that community walked out each night across the front lines to find leaves and salt, because there were no longer leaves in their village, to feed their own children as well as those of their new neighbors. Humanity exists everywhere with the same force and power that it always have. I have hope because I know there are many among you who still believe in the multilateral system to which I am engaged, who give all to that grand idea that I read at the beginning of the United Nations, the Charter. Those who engage in humanitarian diplomacy, fund humanitarian action, and as I said, like Qatar, who see the links between these two. And we have recently defined humanitarian diplomacy, which is so commonplace and important in these parlous times, as having three elements. Firstly, the negotiations, like we're seeing now in Sudan, to create the opportunities